So, here is something that should not be possible inside an institution this old. Yet on a Thursday evening in August, inside a private sitting room at Windsor, King Charles reportedly sat down in front of a cream-colored folder with 4 words printed across the front, and before he reached the bottom of the first page, he had already read what appeared to be the end of his wife's royal life. Prince William and Catherine had placed that folder there, and inside it was a rule that could completely change what happens after Charles's reign ends. The rule said that when Charles dies, the household surrounding his wife dies with his reign. No second royal court built around Camilla, no inherited staff, no inherited offices, no separate press operation, and no assumption that Clarence House simply continues as a royal headquarters under her name. Charles did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He did not order anyone out. He simply read to the end of the page, leaned back in his chair, and asked for his wife to be brought upstairs. By 10:07 that evening, Camilla was sitting in front of the same sheet of paper, being told by her stepson what her position would be after her husband was gone. But underneath that first page was another sheet. Camilla had not seen it. 3 words were printed at the top, and underneath them was a list of names. And Camilla's name was not the only one there. That second page is what turns this from a simple family confrontation into something much bigger, because once you understand what was written there, the entire argument changes. There was supposedly a cream folder at the center of this story, 4 words on the cover, and everything that followed came from what was inside it. So let me take you back to the beginning. Windsor Castle. Thursday, the 13th of August, 2026. The note in the King's diary described the meeting as future transition arrangements. On paper, that sounds almost completely harmless. Future transition arrangements can mean diaries, staffing, patronages, office changes, retirement plans, the sort of administrative matters that are normally handled quietly. Charles arrived at 6:25 expecting exactly that kind of conversation. Instead, he walked into the room and found William and Catherine already waiting. Between them, on a low table, was the cream-colored folder. No royal crest. No dramatic seal. Nothing that immediately suggested what was inside. Just 4 words across the front in a plain typeface. Charles sat down. He looked at William. Then Catherine. Then back at the folder. He waited for one of them to open it. William did not touch it. Catherine did. She opened the folder and turned it around so Charles could read it himself. And before anyone said a word, the king understood something. This had not simply come from William. Catherine was involved. Charles read the first page in silence. And what made the page so powerful was what it did not say. It did not say Camilla would lose her title. It did not demand that she disappear. It did not attack her marriage. It did not even use her name. The language was colder. One sovereign. One working household. One center of royal authority when the next reign begins. Read by an administrator, it was housekeeping. Read by a 77-year-old king with a cancer diagnosis, it meant something much more personal. Charles understood the consequences before reaching the bottom. If he died before his wife, there would be no second royal court automatically built around his widow. No palace machinery passing to her as if it were an inheritance. No communications office automatically answering to her. No permanent staff remaining with her simply because they had served during Charles's reign. And no assumption that Clarence House would continue operating as a royal headquarters under her name. Camilla would remain family. Her lawful status would remain untouched. Her personal causes and public life would not simply disappear. But the machine, the institution around her, would not automatically follow her. And that distinction is everything. Because a royal household is not simply a building. It is the staff and structure surrounding a working member of the royal family. Private secretaries, diary managers, press officers, communications teams, and an address from which the operation is coordinated. Put all of that together and you have someone operating as part of the institution. Take it away. And you have a private individual with a famous name who must rely on another office for the machinery of public life. Camilla had spent years surrounded by that machinery. And the page in front of Charles was effectively saying that it would exist for as long as Charles was king. And not automatically for one day beyond his reign. That was the announcement Charles never expected to hear from his own son. But this did not begin with William simply deciding that Camilla should have less power. 3 days earlier, at Kensington Palace, Catherine had reportedly been reading a briefing about previous royal transitions. Most of the material was routine. Offices moving. Diary changes. Patronages. And the mechanisms used to carry responsibilities from one reign to another. Then Catherine reached 1952. King George VI died at Sandringham. His elder daughter returned from Kenya as Queen Elizabeth II. And his widow became Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother. She moved into Clarence House and remained there until her death in 2002. For decades, she remained a major royal figure with her own staff, her own diary and her own household through much of her daughter's reign. Catherine reportedly read that section twice. Then she stopped at a phrase in the briefing. Queen Mother Precedent. Inside the monarchy, precedent is never just history. A precedent can become an instruction. And an instruction can become an expectation. Catherine asked what that precedent would mean for Camilla. The answer was that a surviving consort could continue public work, keep a household, keep patronages, and remain surrounded by people who had worked for her for years. Catherine listened. Then came the question nobody wanted to answer. Would Camilla have her own household? The silence was apparently long enough to become an answer. Because Catherine's concern was not the charity work. It was the structure. Give someone a household and you have given them advisors. A diary. A press operation. Staff. A residence. And an independent ability to operate publicly. Each piece looks harmless alone. Put them together. And you suddenly have another center of gravity inside the monarchy. A second structure operating beside the sovereign. And the 1952 model had one enormous difference. Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother was the new Queen's mother. That relationship was the foundation. Camilla would be William's stepmother. Catherine would eventually be Queen. Different relationship. Different history. And decades of complicated history underneath it. Catherine then asked William whether they were preparing their own reign. Or simply preparing to inherit assumptions created for another family in another century. William's first instinct was reportedly to leave the issue alone. Not because he necessarily wanted a second court. But because he knew exactly how challenging it would look. The headlines would write themselves. Revenge. Diana. Camilla. Catherine pushing another queen aside. William settling an old family account. And William had spent decades avoiding that story. His mother died on the 31st of August, 1997. He was 15. 6 days later, he walked behind her coffin while millions watched. He had to keep his emotions under control while the institution continued moving around him. A man who carried that experience from childhood was unlikely to deliberately create another public war with his father's wife. He would probably absorb enormous pressure rather than give the press another royal battle. But Catherine reportedly pushed the conversation somewhere William had not expected. She said that if the rule looked personal, then make it apply to her too. If William died first and George became king, Catherine would accept the same rule. No separate court built around herself. No independent household simply because she had once been queen. No inherited command over her husband's staff. No second institution standing beside her son's reign. She would remain George's mother. She would keep her dignity, her lawful position, and her causes. But the machinery of the monarchy would belong to George. That changed everything. Because once Catherine placed herself under the same rule, it became much harder to call the proposal a punishment aimed at Camilla. It was no longer simply about one woman. It was about the structure of every future reign. The discussion then became more practical. What happens to the communications staff? Do they remain with the widow? Or return to the sovereign's office? What happens to the private secretary? What happens to patronages? Which belong personally to the consort? And which came through the crown? And what happens to a royal residence? Can it remain connected to the previous court without becoming a second head office? Then came Clarence House. A residence can be a private home. But it can also be an operating base. The difference is not the building. It is what happens inside it. Staff arriving every morning. Guests being received. Charities meeting. Diaries being arranged. Press statements being coordinated. Charles had known Clarence House for decades. The Queen Mother had lived there. Charles had also used it as his own working headquarters before becoming king. So when Clarence House came up, the atmosphere reportedly changed. William did not answer immediately. Catherine watched him. The advisors waited. And William understood that this could not simply be settled among staff and presented later as a finished document. His father had to hear it directly. The meeting was placed in the king's diary as future transition arrangements. Windsor. Thursday evening. Charles arrived expecting administration. Instead, he was confronted with a principle that could potentially reshape every reign after his. Shortly after 6, Charles reached the bottom of the first page. He looked up slowly. William sat opposite him. Catherine kept the folder open. One hand resting near the second page. Charles's first reaction was disbelief. "This is about Camilla." William answered carefully. "It affects Camilla." Charles looked directly at him. "That's the same thing." And Catherine reportedly spoke before William could continue. "No. It is not." That apparently unsettled Charles more than a shouting match would have. His daughter-in-law had challenged the assumption directly. Charles looked back down at the page. A new reign begins with one sovereign. One central household. One chain of institutional authority. A surviving consort keeps personal dignity and family standing. But no office, residence or staff structure carries forward by automatic right. Then Charles reached the issue he had known was coming. And Clarence House? Nobody answered immediately. That silence carried decades of history. Clarence House was not simply another royal address to Charles. It was connected to his grandmother. To his childhood. To the Queen Mother. To a model that had existed for generations. For decades, Charles had watched a widow remain a powerful royal figure without threatening the woman on the throne. Now William was telling him that the model might end with his own reign. Nothing is automatic. Not the house. Not the office. Not the staff. Not the institutional role. Charles leaned back. And suddenly the conversation stopped being constitutional. It became personal. And if I am not here to protect her? For a moment, the monarch disappeared. What remained was a husband thinking about what would happen to his wife after his death. William's face softened. But his answer did not. "She will not need protection from us." Charles asked. "Then what do you call this?" William paused. "A boundary." And that was perhaps the hardest moment of the evening. Charles had waited longer for the crown than any heir in British history. He became king in 2022 at the age of 73. Then came the announcement of his cancer diagnosis. Now he was being asked to imagine a future in which the crown had moved on. His wife was still alive. And the institution he had spent his life preparing for no longer automatically belonged to either of them. Then Charles turned to Catherine. He had assumed she would be supportive and gracious. Perhaps she would simply help calm the room. Instead, she reportedly said something that changed everything. "It applies to me too." Charles stared at her. Catherine continued. "If William dies before her and George becomes king, she accepts the same rule. No separate court around his mother. No inherited staff. No permanent institutional voice next to George's throne." Then came the sentence that supposedly stopped the room. "My son should never have to inherit my authority as well as his father's crown." Charles looked down at the folder. And said nothing. No explosion. No dramatic refusal. No one was ordered out. The rule was simply sitting there. And Catherine had voluntarily placed herself underneath it. That made it impossible to dismiss as a punishment against Camilla. After some time, Charles reportedly made one request. Camilla should hear it directly from them. That evening, at 10:07, the door opened. And Camilla walked into the room. She knew almost immediately that something serious had happened. Charles was sitting back in his chair. William was tense and controlled. Catherine was beside the open folder. Nobody offered the easy smile normally used to soften an awkward family conversation. Camilla looked at her husband. He did not explain. William asked her to sit down. His tone was formal. Almost painfully formal. She looked at the folder and asked what had happened. William did not begin with her title. He did not begin with Clarence House. He began with the future. He explained that he and Catherine had decided how their household would operate when the next reign begins. One sovereign at the center. One principal working household. Other family members could remain active and respected. But no second court would continue automatically beside the new king. Camilla understood quickly. Meaning yours? William corrected her. Meaning the king's. That distinction was the entire point. Catherine then said. You remain family. Camilla looked at her. But not royal. Catherine did not move. That is not what was said. William stepped in. Her lawful status does not disappear because a reign ends. She keeps her personal charitable interests. She attends family occasions. She appears publicly when the sovereign invites her. Respect does not stop when Charles stops. The automatic part stops. That is the line. And then came the practical details. Staff serving the reigning household answer to the reigning sovereign. Communications go through the new court. Residences connected to royal work are reviewed. Nobody was physically taking anything away from Camilla that night. But nobody was promising that the machinery would follow her either. She turned toward Charles. The moment you are gone, I disappear. William answered first. No. He explained that disappearing and losing automatic institutional authority were two different things. A former queen could remain part of national life without operating a second court beside the sovereign. Then came the sentence that reduced the entire argument to one line. Family is not the same as government. Camilla went still. Because everything she had built over the years was connected to that machinery. The engagements. The patronages. The causes. The staff. The communications operation. The public role. The document did not erase any of it. It simply refused to guarantee that the structure beneath it would survive her husband. Nobody was taking everything away. They were simply refusing to promise that it would continue automatically. Camilla looked toward Catherine again. And there was apparently no satisfaction on Catherine's face. Because she knew what the rule cost. She had already placed herself under it. She told Camilla that if William died first and George became king, she would not ask her son to maintain a separate household around his mother. No independent court. No inherited command over staff. No permanent institutional voice beside George. Camilla's expression changed. And instead of asking what she would lose, she began asking what the rule actually meant. Was it written only for widows of kings? Would it apply to every future consort? Could a future sovereign simply reverse it? Those were the right questions. William turned toward the folder. Because the answers were sitting underneath the page she had just read. Camilla thought she had reached the end. Then William turned the first page over. And there it was. The second sheet. 3 words at the top. And underneath them. A list of names. Camilla's name was there. But it was not first. The principle supposedly applied to every surviving consort who outlived the sovereign they served. Catherine was listed. The future spouse of George was listed. And even future consorts who had not yet entered the royal family were covered by the principle. Charlotte was covered too. For the day the crown might ever come to her. And suddenly the argument changed. This was not simply a private arrangement for Camilla. It was a succession principle. A reign ends. And the institutional household ends with it. The next sovereign can invite a former consort to continue public duties. They can keep causes. Keep patronages. Appear at major occasions. But none of it continues because it existed the day before. Authority has to be renewed in the reign where it belongs. Camilla read the second page much more slowly. Because she could no longer argue that she had been singled out. Catherine had accepted the same rule. Future consorts were covered. The structure was designed to survive the people currently sitting in that room. And that was why it was so difficult to challenge. Charles saw the same thing. The question was no longer whether his wife deserved respect after he was gone. The question was whether any former consort should carry an independent institution into someone else's reign. And William had reportedly already asked someone else about that principle. Days before Windsor, he took the issue privately to his Aunt Anne. And had watched the royal machinery from closer than almost anyone alive. William wanted to know whether ending the Queen Mother model would weaken the institution. Her answer was reportedly short. Different reign. Different family. He pushed again. Did she agree with the principle? She did not turn it into a personal judgment against Camilla. She kept it focused on the crown. The next king has to be allowed to be king. That was the heart of it. Loyalty to a former queen could remain personal. Warm. public, and respectful, without creating a second chain of command. Respect survives. Influence survives. Automatic authority does not have to. Back at Windsor, William reportedly explained exactly that to his father. The principle was not designed to erase anyone's history. It was designed to stop history becoming a permanent instruction. The Queen Mother model worked in its own time. But that did not mean every reign afterward had to reproduce it. Charles looked at the names on the second page again. And for the first time that evening, he was not reading it only as a husband. He was reading it as a sovereign. Looking at a rule that could still exist when George was an old man. Camilla had one more question. Could a future king reverse it? William's answer was simple. A sovereign can always shape the household of his own reign. That was the entire point. The rule would create an expectation. But no previous household would have an automatic claim over the next one. Camilla could remain important because a future king chose to include her. She could not remain important because precedent forced him to. Charles closed the second page. His hand remained flat against it for several seconds. Nobody spoke. Then the evening began to break apart. Camilla stood first. Catherine followed. There was no slammed door. No shouting. No dramatic scene for the newspapers. Just four people being extremely polite to one another in a room where something permanent had supposedly been put on paper. William expected his father to end it there. But Charles asked his son to stay behind. Camilla left with Catherine. The door closed. Father and son were alone. And Charles was finished asking about his wife. His next question was about Catherine. Had William really considered what the rule would do to his own wife one day? A reign ending early. George inheriting before anyone was ready. Catherine still alive. Still loved. Still respected. But no longer at the center of the institution she had helped build. Could William imagine that without bitterness? He looked toward the door Catherine had walked through. And reportedly answered that Catherine could. Because she had already decided it for herself. She had not accepted the principle because it was easy. She accepted it because the next sovereign should inherit freedom along with the crown. And if that sovereign was her own son, his mother would not become a permanent second center of authority simply because she was popular. The argument had started with Camilla. But it ended with Catherine. And that was why it held. The following morning, Friday the 14th of August, William and Catherine reportedly went through the wording again. No reference to Diana. No criticism of Charles. Nothing aimed directly at Camilla. Nothing that could easily be described as revenge. The principle remained simple. One reign. One sovereign. One court. One working household. William signed first. Then he turned the page toward Catherine. She read the sentence again. And placed her name beside his. 2 signatures. No ceremony. No public celebration. Because both of them had supposedly put a future loss onto paper. And one of them would eventually have to live through it. For decades, the Queen Mother model had stood as proof that a widowed queen could remain one of the most visible figures in Britain long after her husband's reign ended. Clarence House became part of that memory. So did the assumption that royal machinery simply carries people forward because it has always done so. Camilla would remain Charles's widow. And a member of the family. She could continue the causes that mattered to her. She could appear wherever the sovereign chose to include her. A future King William could still invite her to major occasions. But the structure of Charles's reign would not automatically travel into William's. And Catherine had written herself into exactly the same future. That is what makes the story much bigger than a family argument. Because popularity would not exempt her. Years beside a king would not buy her a second court beside her son. One reign. One sovereign. One household. But there is one final issue nobody inside that room could completely control. None of this has been publicly announced. And Britain has faced a similar question before. In February 2022, on the 70th anniversary of her accession, Queen Elizabeth II issued a message expressing her wish that when Charles became king, Camilla would be known as Queen Consort. That message carried enormous weight because it came from the reigning monarch herself. A sovereign had effectively reached forward into the next reign. And helped shape the position of the woman who would be there after her death. The principle William and Catherine were supposedly creating takes the opposite approach. The previous reign does not automatically decide the next one. It applies to old precedents. It applies to past arrangements. And eventually, it would apply to William and Catherine themselves. That is the part that makes the principle difficult to dismiss as personal. The public has never seen the folder. For years, Britain watched Camilla become an established part of royal life. Through her husband. Through the late Queen. Through palace offices. Through public engagements. Through years of work. That process happened publicly. But the supposed restructuring of it took place quietly. Inside one room. On one Thursday evening. Without raised voices. Charles reportedly walked into that room believing he was going to discuss staffing. He walked out having seen the monarchy after him. And perhaps that is why the silence matters more than any argument. For a few minutes, a king who had waited decades for the crown sat looking at a future where his authority had ended. His sons had begun. And the woman he had spent decades protecting and supporting would be outside the structure. Waiting to be invited in by someone else. And that brings us back to the real question. When one reign ends and another begins, should the old royal machinery automatically follow the people who were part of it? Or should the new sovereign decide who stands beside the crown? If this principle really was written at Windsor in August 2026, then the most important person affected by it may not be Camilla at all. It may be Catherine. It may be George. It may be Charlotte. And eventually, every consort who comes after them. Because once a monarchy writes a rule for the future, the rule eventually comes back for everyone. One reign. One sovereign. One household.